Gospel for today is from John 20, beginning at verse 19. That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. As he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. They were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. Again he said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." Then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." One of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the Twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he replied, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound in his side." 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe." "My Lord and my God," Thomas exclaimed. Then Jesus told him, "You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. And here ends the gospel for today.
Thanks be to God. How's everyone doing? Good. Well, I don't plan on changing that. But today's passage, I love it, and I really say that about every passage I preach on because it's true, but it's so important for our daily lives as Christians and also the lives of other people. Here we return again to the events of Easter, but now it's evening of that momentous day. And this is Jesus' first appearance to the disciples as a group. He's already appeared to Mary Magdalene and the other women at the tomb. As recorded in both Luke chapter 24, verse 33, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 15, or chapter 15, Jesus has already appeared to Peter alone, one-on-one. And he's also appeared to the two men on the road to Emmaus. And so here, starting with verse 19, we read this, and Mary did such a great job. I'm just going to review just a little of it. But it says that Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. As he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. It says they were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. Again, he said, "Peace be with you." And if you then scroll down to verse 24, we read what I want to focus on this morning. And it's a very familiar passage to most of us. But there we read one of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the Twin or Didymus, was not with the others when Jesus came. And they told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he replied, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, place my hand into the wound in his side." Because of Thomas's response here, we probably have come to know this disciple as anyone? Doubting Thomas. And often with a decidedly negative connotation, when you think, Doubting Thomas. And Thomas has worn this negative label for roughly 2,000 years now. Probably sick of it. But that's how we know him, Doubting Thomas. And so anyone who has doubts also might be afraid of being seen in this negative way. That we are somehow a doubting Thomas. And yet, what do we clearly see in today's Bible text? How does Jesus respond to Thomas's quest for more evidence? If you take a look, starting in verse 26, we see Jesus' response. It says, 8 days later, the disciples were together again. And this time, Thomas was with them. The doors were locked. But suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. Then he turned to Thomas. Like, dun, dun, dun. He said, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. So what do we see here? I don't know about you, but I don't see a rebuke here. Instead, Jesus graciously invites Thomas to look. He readily gives Thomas evidence, proof of the truth. That he is risen from the dead, that he is alive. And if we look back at verse 20, and I think this is important, if you look back at verse 20, Jesus' appearance to the 10 disciples when Thomas was absent, we see Jesus doing the exact same thing with the other disciples. We read as he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. You see, Jesus wants to show them the evidence. In his earlier appearance, they don't even have to ask him. He immediately shows them the evidence. And what I find very interesting and what I want you to really focus on today is Jesus doesn't do this just this once on Easter. Or even just 8 days later. You see, we may kind of think of Easter as a one and done. You know, it's like we all get dressed up, we come to Easter, that's the big show. We see the empty tomb, he's risen. Whew. Now, next week, I'm staying home. I have nothing left to see. I was there. But you see, Jesus presents the disciples and others the truth numerous times. And get this, over a span of 40 days. Now that might not seem a lot to us, but think about that. Over a month of appearances to people. Over a month. Luke sums it up in the book of Acts saying this. He says, during the 40 days after he suffered and died, he appeared to the apostles from time to time. And he proved to them in many ways that he was actually alive. Jesus clearly wants them to know the truth. And these apostles who witnessed these things have recorded it for us. And I just want to quickly highlight this morning what is recorded about his appearances. And this will be just a highlight, but I want you to get a breadth of, or the width of these appearances. As already mentioned, he appears to Mary Magdalene and the other women on Easter morning. And he speaks to them. I mean, think of that. He speaks to them. He appears to Peter one-on-one. He appears to the two men on the road to Emmaus, opens their minds to the scriptures about him, and sits down to eat with them. Pass me the salt. He appears to the 10 disciples Easter evening. Today's passage shows them his scars. And in Luke, it's recorded that Jesus has them give him a piece of fish so they can see him eat it, that they'll know he's not just a ghost or an apparition. He appears to all 11 disciples 8 days later. Again, today's passage, and again speaks to them and invites them to see and touch his scars. Later, he appears to 7 of the disciples while they're fishing in Galilee. So now they've moved away from the crucifixion and resurrection in Jerusalem. Now they're in Galilee, by the Sea of Galilee, and they're fishing. And he gives them a miraculous catch of fish. And he even makes breakfast for them. Later, he appears to all 11 disciples on a mountain in Galilee. He appears to 500 people at one time, as recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He appears to James, Jesus' brother, also recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And finally, he appears to the disciples in Bethany on the Mount of Olives. So back in Jerusalem, near Jerusalem. And he ascends before their very eyes. So we see that Jesus is not adverse to us and others seeking the truth. And how glad we can be that Thomas and the other disciples looked closely into what they were being shown. Because now we can feel more secure in their testimony about him. It wasn't just like, I don't remember what I saw. I wasn't looking. I was watching television. I mean, they were focused on what they were seeing, and they recorded it later, blow by blow. And we can understand why they gave their lives for this truth. They weren't living with a blind faith and unknowing. And you see, the reason this is so important for us is our learning the truths about our faith can do the same for us and others. Our learning the evidence is not a substitute for the work of the Holy Spirit. Only the Holy Spirit can draw you to confident, assured faith. But you see, our learning the evidence of our faith is an aid to our faith and our talking with others about Jesus, those with doubts. And what I want to lift up to you today is there's a passage that tells us clearly to prepare ourselves in this way. In 1 Peter chapter 3, and it's verses 15 and 16. So 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. The Apostle Peter writes this. He says, and you're very familiar with it, I'm sure. If someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Always be ready to explain it. But he says, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. If we take a close look at what Peter is saying in this passage, the word translated explain. So, and if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. That word explain comes from a Greek word, apologia. And in ancient Greece, apologia referred to a lawyer arguing for a case in court. Now, this is not arguing or being defensive in a negative sense, but instead it simply refers to, and I know having been an attorney, I know why you're standing in front of that judge. It simply refers to giving reasons to support a conclusion. And that is where our word apologetics comes from. If you've ever heard of studying Christian apologetics, it comes from this Greek word apologia. Now, to be honest, I'm not a big fan of the word apologetics. For the simple reason that it sounds like we're apologizing for something. I am so sorry about the Christian faith. See, we're not doing that. We're not apologizing for our faith, nor are we being defensive about it. Rather, we are giving reasons and evidence for what we believe. See, a Christian apologist is a person who presents a case for the Christian faith. And that's what the Apostle Peter is saying we should all be prepared to do. And again, it's not looking for a fight. We're not going out to, I'm going to debate these people and we're going to really mix it up. In fact, Peter tells us to be gentle and respectful. But I will say this, it seems that in our increasingly unbelieving culture, we won't have to search for opportunities to defend our faith. They will likely find us. And I think maybe even more importantly, they'll find our children. And they'll find our grandchildren. You see, the statement from 1 Peter chapter 3 is for us to be prepared for these opportunities. Now, that doesn't mean we need to be apologetic experts. When I was young, my parents bought the World Book Encyclopedias, every volume, A to Z. And I don't know, maybe I was a nerd, but I started reading them. I took first entry, A1. It's an insurance term, meaning the company is very stable. It's a good one to insure. See, it didn't start as a steak sauce. I also learned acetylsalicylic acid. Anyone know what that is? Aspirin, yeah. See, great information. But you see, the point why I bring this up is I don't need to know everything that's in the encyclopedia. I don't have to be an expert on everything that's in the encyclopedia. All I need to know is basically what's in there so that I can direct myself or I can direct other people to that source if they want to know more. But I think that for us to learn the highlights of our faith will be immensely important as we talk to a growing culture of unbelievers, those with doubts. And so in this year that we're in, I was going to say in the coming weeks, but I don't know that I'm going to be prepared. See, I'm preparing too. But in the coming weeks and the coming months, we're going to take a little of that evidence. We're going to take a look. I'm not going to feed you the whole thing at one time. It's probably too much. But we're going to take piece by piece a little bit, and you'll know the evidence for your faith so that we'll be better prepared. Just like Jesus took time to prepare his early disciples, including Thomas. And so what I would like you to take from this message is all the appearances that Jesus made. It wasn't just Easter. It was over a 40-year period of appearing to people, eating with them, talking with them, saying, take a look at my side. If you don't think it's me for some reason, he had a twin, take a look. I've got the scars. Take a look. And that's what we're going to do, like I say, is take a look at the evidence. Because I'll tell you, it's overwhelming. So leave today with a stronger faith. We have the recordings of many appearances